moment of drama. This is an unusual topic, especially when paired with ethics, but I think hopefully over the next 45 minutes you'll see why I think it is completely and utterly dovetails with the conversation of ethics beautifully. So this can be done. We can talk about clown and we can talk about ethics at the same time, and I attempt to do that. But I'd like to start a very, very long time ago with two thinkers who I think veritably defined ethics in the Western way of thinking. And of course, that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. In about 380 BC, in one of the classic treatises on government and on society, the Republic, Plato famously and curiously took great pains to discuss in that treatise the placement of theater, or what he called the poetics, or poetry, in the life of Greek citizens. As if our Constitution had a whole section on theater. I mean, I'd love it, but that's not what our focus is. But Plato took some time, and in the Socratic dialogue, famously kind of smeared theater and smeared poets and the people who wrote theater. He wrote, and here are a couple of his quotes: "All poetical imitations are ruinous to the understanding of the hearers." And he says, quote, "Must we not infer that all these poetical individuals, beginning with Homer, are only imitators? They copy images of virtue and the like, but the truth they never reach. The poet is like a painter who, we have already observed, will make the likeness of a cobbler, though he understands nothing of cobbling. And his picture is good enough for those who know no more than he does." As a theater person, I read this, I'm like, ugh. "Poets," he goes on to say, "understand their nature only enough to imitate them." Ugh. While often, and I purposefully do present this as a sort of anti-theater polemic, it's not really, and it's often misinterpreted as a takedown. Frankly, Plato in this is going after some of the popular artists, the popular theater people of the day, and saying, well, they're not really doing it right. He calls them, in that language that we just heard, imitators, copiers, the sorts of things copying we would ask our students not to do, right? I prefer to look at it a different way, and I think his protege, Aristotle, did as well. He responded later on in one of the most famous documents in theater theory ever written, the Poetics. Aristotle, ever the pragmatic, the practical empiricist, if I could put it that way, decided to make some clear definitions about what theater and performance is and what it should be. Of the form of drama, he writes the following: "Comedy is an imitation," I'm going to emphasize that word, imitation, "of men who are inferior but not altogether vicious." Keep that in mind. That's going to be really central in the way I talk about comedy and clown going forward. Now, on the other side of the aisle, if I could put it that way, he says a lot more about tragedy. And tragedy, he has the Poetics is basically about tragedy. And he writes, and this is what's often quoted in introductory theater classes: "Tragedy, then, is the imitation of a good action, which is complete and of a certain length, by means of language made pleasing for each part separately. It relies in its various elements not on narrative, but on acting. Through pity," and this is important, "through pity and fear, it achieves the purgation, or the catharsis, of such emotions." Now, in Theater 101, we'll spend a good 2 weeks on that quote and take it apart and so forth. But we're going to do that just for about 45 minutes here today and then have some conversation about it. So these ideas that come out of these two quotes are important, very important. A tragedy contains what Aristotle will call a hamartia, or a tragic mistake. That'll be important when we connect this to ethics. True tragedy comes when the lead character, the hero perhaps in the drama, doesn't make the mistake, right? That generally happened long ago. Comes when he, generally he in Greek tragedy, recognizes that he made the mistake. That's called the peripeteia. We'll talk about that as well. The reversal happens, the peripeteia. He says, and I call it, excuse my language, I'm a theater person, I'm going to use all sorts of language. That's the oh shit moment, the oh god. That's the moment of drama. The imitation, the doing something wrong unwittingly, and then having the moment of recognition, in which case the story veers off into another direction. So, take a step back, and I acknowledge that you all came here to learn about clown, and I just spent 5 minutes talking about dense theoretical theory. I'm going to move away from that, but we have to have that as a focus, because everything we talk about within the Western theatrical canon really does need to necessarily go back to these Greek thinkers. And I think it's so important, and I often quote with my students my mentor, a guy named Oscar Eustis, who talks very eloquently about this, and in a TED Talk he did a few months ago, he put it so clearly, and I'm like, okay, I'm stealing that. So I give him the credit. But one of the things he says, and I want you to process this over the course of millennia and the course of Western thought, that it is no coincidence that drama, the theater, and democracy were quite literally invented in the same decade and in the same city. 510, 500 BC in Athens, Greece. How did it happen? Well, we can get a little reductive here, and I am going to be a bit reductive. But we had actors before. There's this guy named Thespis, who may or may not have been the quote-unquote first actor, where we get the term thespian, who had been doing drama for a while, but he had been standing up and reciting the poets, reciting poetry. What happens between 510 and 500 BC, along with the creation of democracy, is the very simple act of being joined on stage by another person and being able to see, now that I'm speaking, and now I'm doing this, speaking to another human being. And a dialogue happens. And that is the formation, essentially, of drama. Why is this important? Because that moment where we made the connection, when we suddenly are talking to each other and with each other, does something that is central to the drama, that is central to clown, that is central to ethical behavior. We can create empathy and recognition along our shared stories. That is the formation of drama. And so the question that one may propose out of all of this, and the question that I think Aristotle and Plato were trying to get at, is what is the purpose of drama in a society? Again, our Constitution does not have that section on drama. It should, because obviously I'm a drama professor. I think it's the pinnacle of all society. Plato wanted something, and Plato, as was his want, wanted something close to a modeling of moral rectitude, and the poets of the age, and of course we're talking about slouches such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, weren't necessarily doing it right. He feared they weren't getting close enough to veracity, they were imitating, they were copying. He asked, can the reciter of poetry actually do something or recite something or convey something to the audience that he has no firsthand knowledge of? And his answer is, no, of course not. You're either, and he says this, you're either a divine or you're a cheat. Aristotle, however, a clear lover of the tragedy, returned time and again to that word, the word that's our focus. Not copying and cheating, I don't like to talk about that, but rather imitation and, critically for us, mimesis. Through the imitation, as we see, of complete acts, the viewer may assess, analyze, and edify. Imitation, not copying. Imitation, says Aristotle, is natural to us from childhood, and I think we all understand that. We all know that as we watch our children play house or whatever it happens to be. He is, perhaps, Aristotle here, a little less precious, I think, than Plato, and acknowledges the fact, the important fact, that we also have to give leeway for arguable probability, what people might later call the suspension of disbelief. To wrap up this sort of introductory theoretical analysis, I think William Shakespeare is on our side, is on the side of Plato and on the side of drama. When, and I think everyone knows this quote, if not maybe the full quote, part of it, from Hamlet. For anything so overdone is from the purpose of playing, whose end, both at the first and now, was and is to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time his form and pressure. In other words, theater is this great form of imitation that teaches us either our role in society, ethical behavior, morals, and the like. So I said I'd say a little bit more about this idea of mimesis. A couple of things from our Greek friends. And the reason I believe that clown is the finest, and none of my acting teacher colleagues are here, so I'm going to go ahead and say this. The finest form of actor training that there is clown. And I do believe that. And writing this lecture in the last couple of weeks, I'm like, no, I'm sure of it. I am sure of it. I will trace it all the way back to Plato if I have to. It is a form that is so deeply and intricately wrapped in, as you'll see with some of my students who are here today, internal reflection on the part of the performer. Who am I? How do I present myself? What are the things that I do that aren't so good? They have to come to terms with that. And then express it for an audience who then has to say, oh shit, the recognition. I do that too. So, a few clarifications as we launch into clown and its ability to affect ethical learning. Going back to Aristotle, comedy is often an imitation of the, these are my clowns, by the way. And I was going to put that on earlier so that you could stare at them and not me. But anyway, comedy is often the imitation of the Aristotelian inferior man. Remember, the lower man, not altogether vicious, but not a king or a god, because we don't want to laugh at them, we want to cry about what they do. So comedy is often the imitation of the Aristotelian inferior man. The fool in King Lear, to use an example that we probably all have some connection with. While tragedy, on the other hand, and very importantly, on the other hand, is the imitation of the mistakes of the kings and queens and the gods. To use King Lear, the apt comparison would be King Lear, right? So he has his fool who adds the comedy because his fool is lowly, he's a king. When he falls apart, we cry. We find that tragic. Kings and queens, gods, often exist, and this will make sense when we get into the realm of actual physicality of performance, the vertical. The hell, heavens, the idea of, right? Whereas clowns and the people who are more terrestrial are about reaching out and being with each other. Just that physicality that I just did there with a couple of gestures, obvious, dramatic, comic. So the idea of the vertical and the horizontal will be important as we look at this. So unless anyone here is a king or queen, or a god, anyone? No. Good, I think this is why we'll enjoy comedy, because we get it. We're like, yes, the oh shit moment. I do that. And that's where, how many of you, when you came in today, had an inherent sense, and if you don't all raise your hands, I'm gonna think you're lying, that clowns are kind of scary. Yeah, you're not raise your hand. We all think clowns are scary, and this drives me crazy because that is the fault of Ronald McDonald. Clowns are not scary, and we don't wear gigantic red shoes. Where did that come from? I'll tell you where it came from. But I don't like it. I don't think clowns are scary, except now I'm going to completely contradict myself and say the fact is, this moment, we're like, oh my gosh, that's me, is actually terrifying. And that's why teaching this also has ethical implications. Students going to that place where they really do have to come to terms honestly and transparently with who they really are and how they're showing themselves. We can always recognize a fake on stage. The fake is the person who is not tapping into something real in themselves. So, those terms, mimesis, from the Greek to imitate, precisely the thing that Plato, Aristotle, Horace, others were focusing on. Now, it's not at all a coincidence, of course, you've already made this connection, that one of the most prominent forms of clown is mime. Again, Ronald McDonald, Bozo the Clown, Marcel Marceau, brilliant, but that's not what mime is. That is mime, that is a form of mime. But what's important, thank you. Many years of training to do that. No, what is important about that is that, and I'm not going to, I could do a whole semester on mime, But mime comes really from Greek traditions, mummers that traversed Europe during the Middle Ages, all the way through to this type of mime that Marcel Marceau was doing. For our purposes today, that mime is often about gestures and the creation of story through gestures rather than text. It's not always the case, but often the case, is what's good for us to focus on today. So the mimes have come from mimesis and this idea of imitation and time immemorial. The other term, which I haven't actually said yet, with anagnorisis, which is better understood in the English as recognition. I said that before. The moment when everything changes, when the character sees what he has done, the oh shit moment, and everything changes. I thought I'd give a little bit better example, one that we all might know from, well, what Aristotle was talking about. Oedipus, the king. The anagnorisis is that moment where, oh my God, I recognize, oops, mistake. I killed my father and I slept with my mother. Oops. That's a huge, huge, huge anagnorisis moment. Typically, we don't have those moments, but we have smaller ones which get us back to the vertical plane. Oh yeah, that time I tripped and fell because I was looking at my phone. Right. That's a little less dramatic, perhaps, and much more in the realm of comedy. In comedy, that moment is tied often to the country bumpkin, the low life, and the decidedly less consequential, and that's what makes it funny. So the confluence of these terms in my teaching is the crux of the matter. The place in which the clown lives is the imitation of the everyday, paired with the hugely dramatic horror of the mistake. And that the horror of the mistake of tripping because I was looking at my phone is intense. That's fun, because it seems incongruous. I want to, and you're welcome to close your eyes, but he's not here. This is one of my clowns from a couple of years ago, fabulous clown. And he did a scene that sort of illuminates this, and I want to imagine, if you will, this gentleman on a beautifully outfitted tricycle. The lights dim, he enters from stage right, pedaling. Very pleased with himself, he looks at the audience. His long tie, which you don't see in this picture, all of a sudden starts getting, interfering with the cranks of the tricycle. And he grinds to a halt. Pause, music stops, and we hear the following. He recognizes there's a major problem. His tricycle has stopped. The music's changed, the audience stares at him, what's he going to do? He looks for someone, anyone, to blame. This is your fault. This is really your fault. But it's not, it's his own fault. So he continues to grind through. The tricycle starts falling apart, a wheel comes off. And eventually, by the climax of Carmina Burana, he is a sobbing mess in the center of the stage. He has to recognize, take accountability for his actions, the fact that he wore a too long tie today when he was riding his tricycle. Really high stakes here. And then he drags the tricycle off the stage, the lights come down, and of course the audience enjoys it. Because what we have in that, granted, is not murdering your father and sleeping with your mother. What we have is something that is altogether more connectable. It's subtle, it's silly, and with stakes that aren't terribly high. In fact, those low stakes are what's critical. So with all of this setup, I want to just say a couple more things about this idea of lessons. So if we're on this horizontal plane, connecting with each other, we then have the opportunity to connect with our very human lessons. And this is where, as you'll see in my teaching, I've been able to bring in some of the ethics principles. But the use of morality, the use of ethics on this stage, this is not new. This is where, when Tracy sent out the call, I'm like, yeah, I'd be happy to do this ethics thing. This is what we're doing. This is all we're doing. This is from Plato and Aristotle. We are dealing with ethics and teaching and being didactic. I just give you one more example. So many of you probably know about morality plays in the Middle Ages. The most famous of them all, a play called Everyman by Anonymous. The lead character doesn't even have a name. His name is Everyman, again, so we can connect with it. At the beginning of the play, Death calls him, says, we're going to death, you're done. He says, no, I gotta get my things in order. But he has time to visit with his friends. What are the names of his friends? The following: fellowship, good deeds, kindred, knowledge, confession, beauty, strength, discretion, wits. His friends might as well be named integrity, trust, accountability, transparency, fairness, respect, rule of law, and viability. Broad topics that connect to the life that he's led. Now, what happens in Everyman, the reason it's such a wonderful play, is he has these scenes of connection with each of these friends. But at the end of the day, when Death says, okay, you've done your, you ready? It's time to go. He says, yeah, I'm going to take them all with you. He says, no, you can only take one. Or only one will go with you to the grave. And of course, the one that goes with him to the grave is good deeds. So the dramatic canon is littered with these ethical didactic stories. And so that's the theoretical frame in which I teach clown. But of course, the fun of clown is to take all of those and throw them out sometimes too. To have that ethical question that rises in front of the audience, and then the clown makes the unethical decision. We all get to see it. The clown might not get it, but we all get it, and then we can learn from it. So as you'll see, I've had the opportunity as an ethics fellow, and honestly, when we started this process only a few months ago, I wrote to Tracy and I said, I don't think I'm doing it this semester. I'm not sure by November 4th I can do this, but we've been able to. And because it's been really kind of wonderful to be able to give the students these topics as places for their clowns to develop. And for example, today you're going to see a couple of explorations of the idea of transparency. That has worked really well in the clown build-up. And I think especially it goes back to the original sort of idea of faking it. As Plato said. So I want to ask a question, and I know I've said a little bit about it already. What do you think clown is? Could you just throw out ideas, adjectives, descriptors?
Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump. Do you mind if I probe that a little bit more? So what about Forrest Gump is clownish, do you think?
I think he is Everyman, but instead of making the wrong, which we would anticipate, the wrong decisions, he seems to always make the right ones, which is
right.
funny too.
Well, and that's also true. You go back to Lear's Fool. The clown often is the smartest one in the room. Mm-hmm. We make fun of them, but they ultimately make the right decision. Yeah. Anything other words that come to mind when you think of clown? It could be red nose, big red shoes. I'm not going to be offended by that. Thanks, Bozo. But what comes to mind?
Mr. Bean.
Mr. Bean, a fabulous clown, right? A very clown of the everyday. Yeah. Others?
Right now, Pennywise.
Yeah, Pennywise. Yeah, in the mold of Ronald McDonald. Yes. Yeah, Ronald McDonald gone really bad, moving away from hamburgers. What else? Anything else?
Funny.
Funny. Yeah, simple thing. We expect a clown to be funny. Often clowns are extremely tragic, and in that tragedy, we do find funny. Other things I would add to all of these, and I'm going to switch past that and we may go back. Marcel Marceau, the idea of the mime, the clown, and the gestural. The idea that clowns are physical often comes from this idea of mimesis and mime. And this is not, as I said before, there's many types of mime. This is not the white-faced creepiness that you might see on Pearl Street in Boulder, although that's fine too. That's the more, a little more the Marcel Marceau type. There's multiple forms. The form I'd like to linger on a little bit more is commedia dell'arte. The popular Italian and French form that really developed out of ancient Roman traditions, but became famous in the Renaissance, around the time of Shakespeare, a little earlier and a little before, in which mime and clowning arises out of mask work. And these are two commedia masks that we use over the theater department. And there's a bunch, we've got a load of them. But this is Pantalone, who I'll say a few words about. And this is Arlecchino, or Harlequin, which we all know. That Arlequin is what contemporary clown is based on. The idea with commedia dell'arte is that you'd have troops, generally families, who would come into a village, let's say, give us a date, 1585. They come into a village, here's our village. And like a good comedian who might come to the event center, comes a couple days in advance, gets to know the community a little bit. I'm going to call you Barbara because that'll be anonymous. I learn a little bit about Barbara. She's a shop owner, and we know about Barbara. And then after they have gotten to know the community, set up in the town square and perform skits, what we call lazzis, L-A-Z-Z-I. A lazzi is a suggestion. And if you go with the idea that I'm proposing, that good clown work is about imitation of reality, I know the community now, and I know a little something about Barbara, and recognition, and mistakes or comedy. We have the platform for a scene. This is entirely made up. I have a book in my office that is all of these ancient, old Italian lazzis. They're simple. This is one I just sort of made up last night. Pantalone, who is always the randy old man. Right? Pantalone is randy, sexually turned on, horny. And he decides he wants to woo a lady, perhaps a shop owner, Barbara. Right. Because now I'm connected to the community, we all get it. Oh yeah, Barbara, my neighbor, she's fine. Arlecchino, the clown character, Arlecchino, we all know Arlecchino, he's the guy who does this. Arlecchino, who's always the trickster, wants to go after Pantalone, who's an old randy dude. And so in cahoots with Barbara, he sneaks into Barbara's bed and replaces it with a mop. Pantalone shows up and proceeds to make love to the mop. That's the lazzi. That's the whole scene. And you can see now with quality performers, and they were really good, you could take that little lazzi, milk it for all it's worth, and create a lesson moment, a learning moment that is steeped in laughter, steeped in connections with the community, and steeped in some ways in ethical storytelling. A common action, sex, always funny. A trick or a mistake, yeah, we're gonna replace Barbara with the mop. A humiliation of the character, the lead character, that leads to a realization that leads the audience to an ethical consideration. The Zani characters, the Arlecchino that I mentioned, and there are a bunch of them, really are the most influential characters in modern clown. This is where we get contemporary clown. Always country bumpkins, always very human, and back to your point, always a little sharper than everyone else, even though no one really realizes it. The clown, in this case Harlequin, recognizes that Barbara is not to be messed with. That is a disrespect, and that becomes the ethical principle around which that lazzi was built. A lazzi, literally, I made up last night. They're so easy to make up, and they're totally fun, right? So, clown quite literally comes from a term, probably a Scandinavian term that means the rustic, the country bumpkin. Why we think of clowns with crazy red hair, weird white makeup, huge shoes that give me nightmares, is so far afield from where this comes from, the rustic who connects with each other, with all of us, that it's disappointing. Because when people say, oh, this clown, it's so scary, I'm like, no, it's not, it's essential. So other clowns of note that I've already mentioned, or haven't mentioned, the clown, and this is a little bit of the history lesson, Joseph Grimaldi is the one from the early 19th century who started doing this hyper-stylized makeup and red wig and sort of the fright clown that leads into eventually Ronald McDonald, but Bozo the Clown. And as I was making this PowerPoint, I had a bunch of pictures of Bozo, and they scared me so terrifyingly to death that I said, screw it, I'm not bringing that in. Go look up Bozo. It's horrifying. It's horrifying. That is not where my clowns live. My clowns come from a teaching method in France by a man named Jacques Lecoq, who I hope some of you have heard of. Jacques Lecoq and a protege of his, Philippe Gaudier. These clowns exist, and my teacher, parenthetical, my teacher woman who I give tons of credit to, since this is being recorded, Dodi, if you see this, I'm borrowing a lot from you, as she knows. Dodi DeSanto, who has a workshop, clown workshop, physical theater workshop in DC, and I go train with her almost every summer. She is the late Jacques Lecoq's American protege, distributing and teaching people his methods. His école in Paris, where most students don't make it out of the first year, is rigorous to the nth degree. This is what his clowns and our clowns have a tendency to look like. This is much less scary than Bozo. This is much more about who we are and the flaws that we make. And there I am, right in the center, because I always position myself, and this is not just because I'm an actor, but because, as you'll see, I think it's the way to teach this, I position myself in the center of the work as well. So Lecoq and Gaulier is a very complicated process, and it starts with a very, very important idea. If you're to assess what it means to be you, and this goes to ethics as well, you have to assess what it means, who you are. And this is where I think so many of us in our contemporary society really don't have any idea. We all go to therapy and we do those sorts of things. But the way he does it is through a process called neutrality, in which he created, with a mask-making friend of his in Italy, a neutral mask. This is a replica of it, but it's a quite good one. In which the mask, yeah, it has character because it's hard to take away character, but it's pretty devoid of character. So if I put on a neutral mask and ask the students, be devoid of character, and then have experiences. What neutrality does is it teaches the student that they're not neutral, that they're always already informed by all sorts of personal baggage, by their own ethical and moral failings, and by their virtues. So that if I give a simple exercise, neutral man, this is one, wakes up in the world for the first time. The student lies down, puts on the mask, wakes up in the world for the first time, takes the mask off, and then all the other students say, that wasn't neutral. Stephanie, you did that thing you always do. And Stephanie gets to say, oh, really? I do that? Oh yeah, I do that. So that neutrality allows us to start seeing who we are, because there is no such thing as getting truly to neutrality. The second build-up, which I do, is called larval masks. And I have 12 or 13 of these larval masks. And just to make this a little more Socratic, how are these different than the neutral mask? More personality.
More expression.
More expression. It's more personality, it's more expression, but with the idea of larval, right, which we all know, it's not fully formed. This is not Hamlet. This is not a fully formed character. And so what the larval mask, once they've found neutrality, the larval mask allows them to come to making some sort of more simple choices. Like this mask, it seems to me, and I haven't actually presented this, I haven't actually done this one yet, but it's more angular. So we put these masks on, we allow some, how does this feel in our body? I don't know how this is going to work. I'm not even going to do it. I'm going to have students do this for us. How does this work in our body? They work on that for a couple of weeks. And then this semester, what I was able to do, and I think it worked really well, is to say, okay, now that you have a general character, it's larval, but it's general. What happens if I give you something, I mean total respect to the Ethics Foundation principles, something that is interpretable, general. Something that, I mean, I wouldn't say vague, they're not vague, but I can interpret that the way I need to. So I say to a group of clowns, or larval masks, okay, go off, here's your mask, create a scene that deals with transparency. And I think we have one ready for you. Are you ready? I think they're there. So this is an example of the larval masks presenting a scene that problematizes the questions that troubles transparency. So that's the scene on transparency. And of course, thank you. That's Katie and Aranza. So again, so what happened? Not a protocol. What happened? What do you think happened? Yeah.
Texting, the one partner was texting someone, the other partner did not want them.
Yeah, totally. So the idea is, that's it, that's the whole scene, right? So let's imitate an act. How many times have we gone to a restaurant and we see someone obnoxiously texting while they're in the middle of a date? Simple act, very much on this level, we get it, this is not kings and queens, this is us. They're obviously, they've been on a few dates before, they're partners. Turns out, as Tom recognized, that she's texting with another paramour. The recognition moment, and the consequences, right? Consequences in this case for not being transparent, for not being honest. Yeah.
Can you talk about the background music, because that has a huge effect, I think, on how we respond to the scene.
Totally does. Can I, a little bit later, because I want to tie that a little bit to the clown, but absolutely. The students in the creation of the scenes, they choose the music. They don't have to choose music, but often, as you'll see with the, you're not going to see with the clowns, but I'm going to invite you all to the clown show in December, you will see it. Has a huge effect. And part of the process of the teaching is learning the appropriate music that goes with it. It doesn't have to happen, but if we have sort of a basic framework, I find adding music really helps tell the story, and so it's part of the teaching process. I'll say a little bit more about it as we move forward. So that goes through a neutral mask. These are some of my other larval masks. This is me in larval mask with my teacher. The larval mask gets us to create a little bit more character and start questioning societal mores, ethics, and so forth. The third step, which in Jacques Lecoq, and this is Mr. Lecoq back in the 70s, teaching what he called buffoon. I'm going to say a few things about buffoon, but I'll also say that I'm not teaching it this semester, and I often don't teach it, and I think you'll see why. So from a pedagogic standpoint, we can talk about ethics and the way one teaches some of these things. Buffon comes from the Latin word buffere, which means to puff or fill the cheeks with air, to deform oneself, to swell in order to provoke laughter. So this form that Lecoq uses and I use in my work comes from a sense of mockery and viciousness. It comes also from a real life situation. These are the outcast characters, and the students are asked to explore their sort of darker selves, the selves that may not be ethical, that may always do the wrong thing, sometimes the ugly thing. This is rooted in medieval times, in medieval realities, when people were being expelled from societies for being unusual, deformed, incorrect, often the disabled, the mentally ill, the disfigured, the homosexuals, the elderly, racially different, wayward women, sexual deviants, minorities, illegitimate children, the list of othering. As my teacher describes, and I'm quoting her word for word in this case because I couldn't put it better, the exiled were ejected from within the city walls and cast out to the swamps to fend for themselves in rancid waters that rotted their flesh and drowned them in filth. It was a pitiful life, but they had nowhere else to go, and so there they would stay, but for once a year, when they were invited back inside the city for the annual Hocktide celebration. This was not purely charitable invitation, though. It gave the beautiful people an occasion to look down upon the exiles and laugh at them, reasserting their own position in society and their feelings of superiority. At the same time, this once-yearly celebration afforded the exiles the opportunity to challenge the authority of the beautiful people, to expose them in the reality of who they are and what they've become, mindless conformists. These were the ancient buffoons that Jacques Lecoq took and developed into character making, a process of clowning that develops into what are the, literally, and you can see why this becomes ethically problematic, I wouldn't say problematic, poorly taught, could be damaging and not terribly good. So I'm very careful about whether or not I go into buffoon. Finding the physical characteristics in each of ourselves that we don't like, we feel ashamed of. Finding, in other words, the beautiful and the performative and the fun in the things about us that are ugly. Buffoon is really intense, and it comes to, and we're not going to show anything in buffoon because it's not to be shown. It's an experiment within the class that we also have to spend a lot of time sort of talking about. The buffoons, as they are the gutter people, right, in sort of historical context, context, are making choices that aren't necessarily on par with the ethics and morals of a society. And what we find in working with it in the classroom, by literally going against all of the ethical principles, by literally finding the ugly in ourselves, is that, and this is the hard part, the hard part of teaching it, that each student, myself included, I don't have a picture of myself in buffoon, it's grotesque, it's awful, is that the student can come to terms with and grapple with, oh my God, that thing I just did on stage that was awful was so much fun, right? And the play of, as we talked with the hot tide, the play of inversion, the play of saying the fools are the kings are the fools. This happens in traditions all over the world. Mardi Gras is a perfect example, but any of the sort of Middle Ages Feast of Fools and so forth. The understanding is especially hard in our society, which has a tendency perhaps to go to a moral superiority in which understanding the ugliness in ourselves is not good. I actually find is an extremely good teaching tool. Sadly, I don't have 3 semesters to teach clown, and so I often eliminate this because it does take time and a lot of conversation. What I generally do is I go from neutrality to larval, and then finally to the last process, which is clown. And these are the 2019 clowns. And this, and I'm remembering, is where I'm going to shamelessly plug on the 6th of December, over in the Ant Center, there will be 2 performances of the clown scenes that this group, 3 of the students you will see today, are going to develop and show. It's about an hour, one at 7:30, one at 9:30. The late night show is always more fun. And they'll show their work. It's totally fun. There will be a reservation site, and I'll send it, and you can maybe pass it on. So this brings us to clown. The realization, as I have been building up, that the most terrifying of all, in many ways, has been the process of breaking down masking. The process of saying, I'm demasking. In order to show my clown, I'm taking this neutral mask, which makes me a little bit invisible. I'm going to something that gives me a little bit more character. Buffoon, I'm putting that aside. And finally, I come to the nose, which is the smallest mask of all. So when I put on the nose, all of a sudden,
You lose credibility.
you can't laugh at nose. No, right? But there is a sense of that. But it's also that there's an element that the nose is so small, so ridiculous. If we're seeing the nose as a mask, which we must, the nose is the mask. It's like what you're covering your nose and expecting to hide. It is symbolically setting up the you can't hide. This is who you are. And that's why clown work is always so terrifying. In this realm, I found that clowns naturally explore ethics and lack of ethics. Naturally, it just happens. It always just happens. By being eternally observant. The clown, going back to the Greeks, mimesis, imitating means I have to be watching so that I can imitate you, right? So there's that extreme curiosity that all clowns must have. The ability to make a mistake, be called on the mistake, and try to fix it. The recognition, mimesis, recognition. So in my teaching, and I've been doing it for about 15 or 20 years now, is that as I've learned to be a clown teacher, different from my own teachers. I take a lot of what they do, but I've inserted myself into the process. By saying, and I think especially with some students, I think at the graduate level I might not need to do this. I think students just embarking on clown and this personal exploration, it's important for me as the teacher not to take myself out of it, but actually insert myself into it, to allow myself to be a character. And so I call myself Monsieur. And I put on a bowler hat. That's it. That's my character. But once I am seen in character, I can go after the clowns. I can attack them. I can call them on their shit. I can say, hey, recognition, what just happened? And then it's okay, it's not really covered. That we can actually go into this sort of exploration of each other and our clowns because I have the hat. That's it. And that's enough, it seems to me, to create the Aristotelian dialectic. The way that the Sir? What are you doing? What are you doing? No, I can see you. I see you. You can't just walk away. What are you? You told me to go. Did you take some of the food? Sir, did you take some of the food? No, you did. I saw you. You went into the dip, and what do you have in your mouth? No, sir. Were you invited? Were you on the sign-up list at the back? Go check the sign-up list, sir. Is your name on the sign-up list? No, it's not. I looked at the sign-up list. It's not there. It's not. Why are you here? Who invited you? Who? Sir, did you invite him? Oh. He invited you? He invited you? I don't think he invited you. I don't think you know her. Do you know him? I think you saw that there was food, sir, and you just... Whoa! Were you making kissy faces at him? No? Sorry. That's inappropriate. That is inappropriate. So is that Jack Daniels? So this is a university. You can't have that here. So you can't have that here. That's alcohol. No, it's not. But I see it right there. That's alcohol. That's inappropriate. It's not? Sir. Sir, why don't you take that brownie? Take the brownie. Take the brownie and please leave. Sir. No, take the brownie with you. And take your Jack Daniels. No, I don't. No, is that a bribe? No, please leave. 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 Sir. Sir, look at me. That was an introduction. You too. Them to take what's clown teaching, take the flop. That moment when we have an ethical fall down, a trip, and Monsieur always notices. What was that? Recognition. His clown, and part of the reason I invited him to do it, he's a little jerk. He is always, and this is already, he's only a couple weeks into developing, his clown is always undercutting authority. No, I didn't do it. No. I'm going to flirt with that woman. No, back over here. So it creates with the character, and eventually what we do is we go through that, we start exploring these areas of ethical fall downs, if I could put it that way, and eventually I start taking myself out. So that by the time you come on the 6th to see it, I'm not in the show, but they've had that experience of dealing with a person in authority and challenging or going along with them. That in a broad nutshell is the way I do clown. I want to acknowledge before I wrap up my comments that I hope you've noticed that I focus a lot on Western traditions. Partly that's because that's my expertise. Partly because we only have an hour and a half to talk about this. But this is some of the things that I illuminated, I hope I illuminated, are all over world cultures. I think of the Spider Trickster and Anansi Theater of Ghana, very similar. He's a spider, which is totally fun. Or anyone knows No Theater in Japan, the Kyogen shows, which are the sort of interact shows that are often dealing with morals and ethics and comic characters. Really, most cultures go through this process in remarkably similar ways. So I have to wrap. I know that my task today, in some ways, is to show how I use ethical principles in my teaching. I'd really love to say, and here's how you can do this too, but I don't know that I can. One of the things I think that happens in the clown, that happens in the theater, is the ethical implications become pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious when you watch Oedipus what the ethical considerations that are happening in that character are. We don't necessarily have to bludgeon the audience over the head with it. Just like I think when you come see a clown show, every scene you're like, oh, I see what they're doing. And yet, I think there are ways, and perhaps we can in our discussion section talk about how this might be used in areas outside of theater. The one thing I do say, and I offer this with total genuineness, is that I'm happy to come into a class and teach, a quick workshop on clown and so forth. That can be done. I think, as I said before, going into and teaching clown can become an ethical problem because we are looking so deeply in ourselves, and I think that has to come with care. And I say with humility, I've had some years of experience with it, and I think I can do that. And not for nothing, these masks are handmade, so I don't expect every department to go off and spend thousands of dollars on masks. But what we can do, I think, one, I'm happy to teach some of these things, but one thing I think we can do is encourage students, and here's where you come in, to participate, to go back to the Greeks, to participate in that form that is time tried as democratic processes, to go to the theater. I'm not just plugging our building. I'm not just saying, oh, please, yeah, but I am. To say, let us engage in our society, let us engage in the culture, because everything we are doing, I say down there as if it's just in a building, but we do it all over the place. When we engage in live performance, is dealing with these things. And as we become, as we saw with the buffoon scene, the lateral mask scene, so engaged only with our small screens, we're losing that thing that happens, right? The Thespis thing, where now I'm engaging with you, and all of a sudden, your blood pressure just changed, my heartbeat changed, we all looked a little closer. That by going to a performance and participating in that democratic, the didactic form, we're able to have a catharsis, to go to Aristotle, or my preference, the oh shit moment. Say, that's me, I do that. And either say, I love that I do that. I love that my society does that. Or say, no, I'm not so sure that's a good idea, and perhaps make change. So then, it seems to me, with clown, we essentialize that. We say, at the end of the day, all of this is about mimesis, imitation, and finally, recognition. Thank you.
A couple minutes for some questions or suggestions. So I would love to talk a little bit about, in business, I have a feeling that a lot of people have masks on, but they're not real masks, they put on they're not their true selves. Sometimes they do bad things.
Yeah. I think the whole thing about clown is why the essential point of hopefully of my talk is that idea of seeing the nose. Where is it? Not as a nose, it's a mask. And to the essentialized point is once that mask goes on, it calls attention to the ridiculousness of its smallness and the fact that we aren't just ourselves, and we have to figure out how to express that through transparency. I think theater students and the 3 students that you saw today you know, at this point when we go into clown, they're pretty advanced, and they've done a lot of the exploration of what it means to be honest on stage, which is, you know, the acting teacher's mantra: are you honest? Are you honest? Are you honest? But I think for students who aren't quite as used to that, it's very scary and very hard. And that's why I do say, genuinely, I'm happy, and I know some of my colleagues have done this already, go into classes across campus where people are maybe a little less secure about doing that, in very gentle ways, saying, what's the mask that you're putting on?
I don't know, are those noses expensive?
No, you can get
I
noses.
can see my class put noses on as we discuss things.
Just put them on away. So it's the only thing I ask.
Yeah.
So that the idea is that I'm doing it, this is a little bit of a construct to allow myself to go a little bit deeper.
I think this is such a great concept. How does a translator, how would you translate that into a regular boring class?
Boring class?
A lecture, say.
You know, I think, and the ways that I've done it in the past, or colleagues of mine do it, I can't go into a business class and say, here, you know, everyone, don noses and let's talk about business. I don't know how to do that, I don't have the expertise, but what I do, I think it is good for human beings to engage in performance, because I believe that all of us are artists. No one deny that. I'll just have a debate with you right now, and I don't want to do that. I think we're all artists. We are terrified of our artistic selves. We exist on the spectrum of art. Some people who have more experience and have the time to do it maybe become quote-unquote professional artists. Some of us who don't have the time to do it, you know, I'm going to just randomly say some student in your business class who's never, always said, no, I'm not an artist, I'm not an artist. I hate it when people say that. It's like, no, you're not. You are an artist. You just might not be as experienced as I am. So one of the things I just do is go in and do some of these workshops because I think, divorced from whatever the topic of the day is in your program, because I think the more we as human beings come to terms with what it means to demask, I think it helps in anything. Because unfortunately, even though we do this, our everyday lives are on this plane about connecting with each other and having human interaction. So no, I wouldn't teach it specific to a topic. I'd teach it specific to itself. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I was gonna have you put a mask on because you're always
put a
vain.
mask on. Like I never wear masks.
That's Arlecchino. So Arlecchino is.
So Kevin.
I think your voice should go a little higher.
So Kevin.
Yes.
So I've been thinking about something.
Yeah.
Seriously. So sometimes masks let us laugh at ourselves.
No, I'm gonna take it off so I can laugh. No, masks do that. Yeah. No, they do. And the half masks, of course, of Canadian dell'arte, they're half masks for a reason, right?
Yeah.
So that there is part of you that is showing through. No, it is. I mean, I'm not. Clown is hard because it goes to the place of demasking. That is not to say that masking isn't totally fun and worthwhile. I could teach a whole semester just on larval masks because there are other things that it develops. It develops the idea of physicality, where I can say, bulbous nose, wide eyes, how does that feel in my body? And then a student who is, you know, I always say, you know, we're learning, especially in the academy, to be brains on tripods, which is not what we are, we're bodies. And that the mask helps us figure out what our bodies do. Neutral mask does that as well. So that is not to say that the point of all work in this realm is to demask, because you're totally right, masks are fun, and they add a level of levity that's a
Well,
whole
it's
other
why
lecture.
we use puppets, right? Because you can distance yourself and not take yourself so seriously too.
Totally. And that's why, for in the clown class, that's where we start, so that you can, in some ways, distance yourself and find those things that are fun. And let's take off the mask a little bit and see if we can still find that fun. And that's why clown is so hard, because once the mask comes off, it's like, oh,